This week on Engage the Sage.
Hi everyone, I'm Don Saucier. Welcome to this week's episode of Engage the Sage. This week we're going to talk about clear communication. As teachers, we are constantly communicating with people. We're communicating with our students, we're communicating with our colleagues, we're communicating face-to-face, we're communicating online, we're writing emails, we're communicating in all the ways, all the time. And it's very important to be clear in that communication, because clear communication is one of the ways that we can support our students' success. Being clear in our communication requires intention and preparation. So what we're going to talk about today are 5 recommendations that you can prepare to make your communication more clear for yourself and for your students. My first recommendation for clear communication is to manage your voice. When we talk, it's important that people understand the words that we are saying to them. So managing our voice is going to help us do that. One of the reasons that we're doing this video is these are recommendations that I am continually working on myself to be clear in my communication. So one of the things that I constantly try to work on is to make sure that when I'm talking that I'm articulating my words and I'm projecting my voice. I try to make sure that I enunciate when I talk. I try to make sure that I'm making eye contact with my audience so I can see whether or not they're hearing and attending to my voice as I talk. I try to manage the pace of my speech, and this is something that I have to work on a lot because I talk really fast, but I try really hard to remind myself to talk at a pace that my students and the people listening to me can understand. When I'm managing my voice, I think about how I'm wearing a mask during COVID-19 pandemic teaching, maybe affecting the volume of my voice or the ability for my students to understand what I'm saying. When I'm wearing a mask, I might focus more on enunciating my words and projecting my voice at a higher volume. I might use my eyes and my hands more expressively to let my students know the emotional content that is going along with the words that I'm saying. And something that I did not used to do pre-pandemic is I may use a microphone when I'm teaching, especially in large classes, so that the people out there can hear my voice at a volume that's going to make sense to them. My second recommendation for being clear in your communication is to be intentional with your words. It is very important that when we're clearly communicating with an audience, that they understand what we are saying to them. Talking over their head is not the goal. Talking at a level that they can understand is the goal. When we're deciding our word choice, it's important that we do not use jargon that our audience does not understand. It may be the point of our conversation to explain what jargon means, and if it is important that our students know the definitions of the words that we're using they didn't know before, that we make those definitions clear to our students while we're talking to them. One of the things that I recommend when we're being intentional in our words is that we intentionally repeat certain words and certain points to make them clear to our students. Repeating important points and important words are going to help our students learn. When we are choosing our words, I think it's important that we choose words that are going to be engaging and interesting to our students. We can choose words that let our students know our engagement in what it is we're teaching. We can use our voice inflection to let our students know that we are engaged in what we are teaching. Now, there are a couple of things to be careful of when we are choosing our words for clear communication. Number one, and this makes me sad because I'm a big fan, is we should be careful in using sarcasm. Sarcasm, especially if I'm wearing a mask with my students, might be hard for my students to understand that I actually mean the opposite of what I'm saying. So being sarcastic is something that we should be clear about. If we are sarcastic, let our students know that we are being sarcastic, and then rephrase the statement in the way that we actually mean it. Another thing to be careful of when we're choosing our words, and we talked about this before when we talked about questioning our students, is avoid rhetorical questions unless your students know they're rhetorical. Also understand if you use a rhetorical question, there's a chance when you really want your students to discuss a question you ask them, they may misunderstand those to be rhetorical too. My third recommendation for clear communication with our students is to organize your thoughts. When we communicate, the organization matters. The order of presentation of the organization matters. So I'm going to recommend that we think about the order of the ideas and the concepts that we're going to be teaching to our students and to make sure that it builds in a logical and progressive manner. Let your concepts and your thoughts build on each other. Let them scaffold in a way that is going to support your students' learning. If we present our information in a way that makes sense, in a way that logically builds on itself, it's going to make that story of that class more clear to our students. It's going to help them learn, and it's going to help them understand both the transitions and the connections. That progressive organization is also going to allow us for some of that intentional repeating of information to build on it to help our students learn it. Another way that we can organize our words to help our students learn is to only use essential words. We can streamline our thoughts, we can make those as succinct and as brief as they can be so that the students know what they need to know and why they need to know it. When we talked about the 4 C's of writing, and we'll link you to that video at the end, when we talked about the 4 C's of writing, we talked about your written communication being clear, complete, concise, and compelling. I think those 4 C's apply to verbal communication as well. So think about ways that you can make your statements clear, complete, but also concise, as short and streamlined as they can be, but also compelling. Say things that your students are going to be interested to hear. Another thing to keep in mind when we're organizing our information is to make sure that we are just not fire hosing information at our students. Don't give out lots and lots of text on a PowerPoint slide or a really long soliloquy and expect your students to keep up with you. Build in breaks, let the information breathe, and let your students stay with you. My 4th recommendation for clearly communicating with your students is to request and be open to your students' feedback. Communication does not work if your audience does not understand what you are saying. If they don't pick up and receive your message, you have not communicated. I recommend that you check in with your students periodically, saying, did that make sense? Do you understand that? Maybe doing a learning check and have them demonstrate that they understood what you were talking about with them. But check in with them and let them know, I want you to understand what we're talking about because your learning matters to me. Show them that caring. Let your students know that if they need you to repeat something, or if they need you to say something louder, it's actually a sign of respect. It's a flattering statement they're making to you because they're letting you know, I really want to hear what you're saying. This is a good thing. So invite that, validate that, and reinforce that. Now, when you're inviting it, be authentic about inviting it. If you're saying, are there any questions, and you're trying to get to the next thing as quickly as possible, was that clear, and you're trying to get to the next thing, you're letting your students know you really don't care about their learning. So when you seek that feedback, do it authentically because it's going to allow you to teach your students better. Another thing to understand is that sometimes your students are going to give you feedback non-verbally. Sometimes they will raise their hand, sometimes they will ask you to repeat something, but more often than not, they're just going to look confused and panicked. If you see your students looking confused and panicked, it might not be a bad idea to restate the concept that you were just teaching. Another reason your students might be panicking is if it's a class in which they're going to be taking notes, you might be presenting information too quickly for them to take notes. So letting your students know that that's important to you and watching for them to be writing or typing and giving them time to do so is another way that we can make our communication clearer. My 5th recommendation for clear communication is to use soundbites. What I mean by a soundbite is a carefully selected phrase or word that is used to help your students understand what you're communicating with them. We'll do a whole video on this another time, but when I'm talking about soundbites now, I'm talking about when we're intentionally preparing to teach our students information, think about the shortest way that you can make that information make sense and be interesting to your students when you teach them. A soundbite should be streamlined, it should be informative, and it should be awesome. What you want to do is you want to think about a way that you can take the information that you just taught your students and put it in an understandable way that's going to make sense to them later. When you're creating a soundbite, you're not using lots of jargon. You're not being overly technical. What you are doing is trying to find a drop-the-mic way to make the information make sense to your students. When you're creating soundbites when you teach, you might invent a phrase. Maybe a phrase like excite nerve, or choice to learn, or trickle down engagement. You may kind of find a way to make information accessible, like the 4 C's of writing that we have: clear, complete, concise, and compelling. You might tell your students in a social justice class that they can be part of the solution or part of the problem. You might come up with ways to make your information really, really powerfully succinct for your students to remember that later. When I've come up with a good soundbite with my class. It's something that I will repeat. They'll hear me say that again and again. They'll hear me say it during the class where I teach it. They'll hear me talk about it when I review that next time. And one of the things that I really like is when my students give me my soundbite back, showing me that they understand the concept that we learned together. Successful communication means you're going to put a message out there and other people are going to successfully receive and understand that message. So what we had for you today are 5 recommendations to make your communication more clear so that your students can learn better. In the comments below, I would love to read really clearly communicated recommendations for how to make clear communication in your classes. I'll also note that part of the reason we're making this video is because people asked us to. They said, hey, could you do a video on clear communication? We think this would be helpful for lots of people, especially as we're all wearing masks in our classes. So if you have any suggestion for upcoming videos, please drop that in the comments too. Thank you for joining us this week on Engage the Sage. Please like, subscribe, sign up for notifications, share us on social media, and we'll see you next time on Engage the Sage.